So now you know that Grid is a great tool that allows you to arrange content on the page. And also you also know different types of grids, right? Remember them. Manuscript, okay. Column, modular, baseline, golden canon, right, 5 of them. And of course the mix of all these different grids. Today we'll be talking about how to create a perfect grid for your content. And the most important thing to understand right away here that for each particular product, you need to define your grid, which means that there is no perfect grid for everything, for absolutely everything. So you just created one and it will work absolutely everywhere. It can work 100%, but if you want to achieve the best result, then it's better to create specifically for your particular content. And that's why it's important to prepare your content first, then to define the hierarchy, and only after that we will start putting this content on the grid. But still, if you need to create the perfect, not the perfect, if you still need to create a grid, you can follow some principles and some tips that I'll share with you today. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'll just create this frame here where I'll put my recommendations, and I'll create another one, 1440 and 100. Okay, perfect. And this frame will be using for web or different type of content. The very first recommendation that I would give you when you are creating absolutely anything, it doesn't matter what you're working on, whether it's social media post, website, whether you're creating dashboard or system for TV app, it doesn't matter. The very first recommendations. And the very first, just a second, I'll make a little bit smaller. I'll put here 1, boom. The very first recommendation that I would give would be use baseline and column grids for your content. Yeah, because they will cover absolutely everything that you need. Let's move here to something like what I'll be using here. Let's go back to robot. It will be much easier to explain everything because this is not the content we are working on right now. I mean, this is less important. So use baseline and column grids. Because, why? Let me explain. First of all, baseline grid works absolutely for any project, no matter what you're working on, even if it's the print material. And column grids also work for absolutely any kind of project, which means that these are unique grids, that universal grids that will allow you to create absolutely anything. So the very first thing is use baseline and column grid. So let's create them here. How to create them we already know, right? So what we'll do, we'll click layout grid here, plus sign. We already have 8 pixels grid defined here. We are not going to use this one because it's overwhelming. Just the grid itself, it's overwhelming. Yes, you can use it, but it's too much. What we'll do, we'll use columns instead. We'll define columns first. And here is another recommendation. Use 12 column grids. For most of the projects, especially like for big screens, larger than 1000 pixels, use 12 column grid. It will allow you to cover lots of things, and the smaller the size that you will be using, like let's imagine 768 by 600. Let's imagine you are creating the tablet or so. In this case, you can go with a lower number of grids. And actually, let me put it here. Recommendation number 2, not with this one. Recommendation number 2 for huge screens, use 12 column grid. For tablets and so use 6-8 column grid. It means that, actually let me put here 100%, 150. This is not the design project, so I can do this. 12 column grid for big screens, actually not huge, just for big screens. For tablets, 6-8 column, and for mobile, I would recommend to use 2-4 column grids. It doesn't mean mobile 2-4, come on, columns. It doesn't mean that you have to follow all these rules, like 12 column grid for this one. For this we will be using 6 columns, and for mobile, which will be like 375 by 812, use 4 or 2. It doesn't mean that this is exactly what you should follow, but just from my experience, 12 column grid covers absolutely everything, covers completely everything for web projects, except but in some cases when you're creating dashboards, you can have 2 grids. The one will be for the sidebar, and another grid will be for all the other part of the content. For tablets, 6 or 8 columns will cover absolutely everything. And for mobile, 2 or 4 columns will also cover like 99% of the situations. Previously, I showed you that it can be even 7 columns grid, but again, it depends on your content that you're creating. 99% of the projects, mobile projects, it will be enough for you to use just 2 or 4 columns. I usually use 4 columns. The reason I use 4 columns here and 8 columns for tablet size, just because it gives me more flexibility. Because of flexibility, we'll be using 12, 8, and 4. Now, what we need to also understand what the grid consists of. The grid consists of columns themselves. These are the red ones are columns. Then it also consists of margins. Margins is this the distance between left and right edges. So here, for example, let's set just an example, 72. Okay, and these are margins, 72 pixels margin. And gutters. Gutter is the distance between columns. And for what should we use for gutter? Usually people think that working with grids are really hard. It's for some people it's like, oh my god, what grid should I use for this or that or that? Let me give you the third recommendations about gutters and margins. And the third recommendation about gutters and margins: gutters should be the size of the line height of your main body text. This is why it's important to define from the very beginning, and even if you will change it later, it's completely okay if you'll change it later. But my recommendation for you is to use, for gutters, to use the size of the line height of your main body text. We define it and we'll be using for spacings later, for gutters, for margins, for lots of different things. We used it also for type scale. So that's why, just keep in mind, you just need to create just one thing. The most important thing when you're working with typography, you need to define the size, the size of the body text and the line height of this body text. And this will give you perfect type scale. This will give you understanding of what grid you will be using. And of course, it will provide better, not usability, readability in this case, when you'll be working on the project. So my recommendation, gutters should be the size of the line height. If we are talking about margins, margin equals 2-3x of the line height. I would say even up to 4. 2 for X of the line height. And if you remember previously, when we created the text, and in this case, let's type something, I don't like this one. Let's take the content from something else. So this is our body 1. And for body 1, we define that it's 28 pixels. So 28 pixels. We haven't started working on the line length, on the horizontal rhythm yet, so that's why we'll just define that, okay, we have some content here. And we have 12 columns for this content, doesn't matter. 28 pixels as a line height, which means that for our grid, we'll be using for Gada 28 pixels. Here you have type stretch, center, right, and left. This defines from what side the grid will be shown, will be drawn. Usually, I'm using, in most of the cases, again, when we are talking, for example, about dashboards, I would use grids left and right. But for all other projects, center or stretch. And stretch is more flexible. It's a little bit harder to work with, just because based on the size of the screen, you see the column is changing its width, which looks great in general, but it's really a little bit harder to work with because we have content here and the content is dynamic and we need to understand how far this grid will go. But still, I recommend to use stretch or centered grid. So this is recommendation number 4. Use stretch or center grid. Okay, so we defined that our Gada will be 28. But now let's define our margin. And for margin, we will just use 28 multiple, and then you multiply it by the number of how far you want the distance to be from the edge of the screen. And how to define it? For e-commerce websites or for galleries where you want to fill in the entire screen, use just 28, for example. And why? Let me explain you why you should use a line height as your main size for Gadas and margins. The reason is pretty simple. For explaining, let me create rows, and for rows we'll create outer from top, and the offset will be 28 and the Gada 28, for example. In this case, we just created offset 0 and height of the rows will be 28. So we created this one. Remember, we talked about 4 pixels grid, like 4 and 4, which looks great. We'll be using it for mobile. Later, I will explain you, should you use always 4 pixels or not? I'll explain you a little bit later in the next lesson. But here, we talked about 4 pixels grid. Let's talk about 4 pixels grid. So we use 4 pixels grid here. This is our content, which is we put somewhere here, and this one is 28. Now, every time, what I can do also, I can create the baseline grid. And because our line height is 28, I can create another grid that will be also outer from the top, height 28, Gada 0, and I will make it just a little bit brighter here, percentage, so I will see the lines, the line height of our text. So let's put the text inside of the our grid, and you see all the lines are sitting on, because everything is divisible by 4, all the lines are sitting inside of this baseline grid. You see, everything is perfect here, which means that when I'll create, for example, I don't know, another content here, like, what do we have here? H2, and it will be something like this. again because everything is divisible by 4, and in this case it's also divisible by 28, which is what we used here. As you can see, again, this text is also sitting on the baseline grid, and it takes 3 rows on our baseline from our main baseline defined by the line height text. And now this is how I can define the distances between all these texts. So I can put one under another one. Let's remove the text. And this is why this is cool to create the baseline grid, because this will allow you to understand what spacings to use between the headings and paragraphs. And in this case, if I'll put it, for example, somewhere here, this also works great because all the text is sitting on the baseline grid. And when everything is sitting on the baseline grid, this is how you can create a perfect hierarchy, and everything will look great just because you are following the baseline grid. And people with experience, designers with experience, will see that in your works, and that's why your work will look much cleaner when you are using the baseline grid. Now let's get back to our line height, why we decided to use the Gata, and in this case margin like this size. When we are using, because we are building our baseline grid based on the line height of the text, and then we are setting the size of the Gata, of the size of these rows, this is how we can create the perfect distancing between elements. Which means that, let's imagine we have box here. It will be, let's imagine that this will be our gallery. The gallery that will take like this. Let's take a look that everything is sitting where it should be. So this is our gallery, or maybe it's there will be our products, and because we are following our baseline, if you'll take a look, everything here is perfectly aligned. The relationship between all the elements is perfect just because we defined that, okay, we said that the spacing between the heading and the paragraph is 1 line. Between paragraph and the carousel, 2 lines. And then between carousel itself, between the elements of the carousel, is 1 line. But at the same time, the distance between the columns, between the elements horizontally, is, because we set it the same as the line height of the main body text. Here inside we have the perfect distance, the perfect ratio 1-to-1 between the rows and columns. You see here all these rows and columns looks perfect, and that's why this even super simple screen, I would make a little bit different thing here, 3 lines. And this is what we already created, super simple and super fast, with this using the baseline grid and the columns grid, where Gata is 28 pixels, which is the size of the line height. This allows us to achieve perfect harmony in our layout, because we were using the same measurements for absolutely everything. This is what allows us to achieve this harmony and perfect vertical and horizontal rhythm. That's why, let's get back to our grid. This is what we were talking about. For Gatas, use the size of the line height. And if we are talking again, going back, like where should you use the margin, not this one, the margin of this size, it can be sometimes 0. It's completely okay if you want to go from size to, from edge to edge, but sometimes it can be 28 multiple 2 or 28 multiple 3 or even 28 multiple what? 4. What should you use? So as I said, if we are using column based on the grid, if you are creating e-commerce website, galleries, something that will take all the entire screen, then use smaller margins. 28 in this case, the size 1x size of the line height will be more than enough. But when you are creating something like promotional websites where you need more readability, where you have more text-based information, then it's better to create something bigger so the entire size of your screen will not be too huge. And in this case, like 12-16 pixels is great. Is really great because half of the grid will take almost 600 pixels, which is perfect for our text, for our readability, so people will see everything easily, and our content, it's enough space for our content for 6 columns, for example. Like in this case. Let's imagine you will put the image here and boom. Perfect. So, can you go even more than 4x here for margins? Absolutely. When you don't have lots of text, but it's still based text information, where you'll be using scale where you will have huge headings. In this case, what you can do, instead of using 4x for margins, and you've probably already seen these websites many times, this usually used for SaaS projects, for promotional websites, for mobile apps, for example, just use for margins something like 28 multiple, even 8, like this one. In this case, the main content will be sitting right somewhere in the center of the screen, which is 992. This is perfect size for reading text, and then you will be able to use this text for up to 10 columns, and it will still be easy to read this text. We'll increase this information here. Here you will have some, for example, image of your product or something like this. Let's use from Unsplash minimal. Doesn't matter. We are selling watches. Great. And then with this grid, when you have not so much text, not too much copy, and you don't have too many images, you don't know how to fill in the screen, all the edges, like everything, just put your text inside, just make margins from left and right edge really huge, and then you will achieve amazing results with your content, and it will still be super easy to read this content. I would go with something even like this. Super easy to read content, and with lots of space around, you will achieve the minimalistic feeling of your website, which looks absolutely amazing and great. Does it apply to tablets and mobile? Absolutely. So what we will do, here we have 4 columns, right? Let's define the margin and gutters for that. When we are talking about mobile apps or mobile versions of the websites, for margins, I would recommend to use 1x of the line height. And in this case, it was 28, but when we are working with mobile, I would recommend to go with the main text as 16 points with a line height of 24. Because the screen is really small. It doesn't mean that you have to go exactly with this one. You can go with 32, for example. But I would recommend to go with 24, so you will cover absolutely everything that you need on the screen, and it will be enough to have this spacing from left and right. And for gutter, we'll be using also the line height of our text. And this is how you create the perfect grid. In addition to that, you know what we'll do? We will copy these two grids, baseline grids, apply it to our mobile, and just because we are using 24, we will set 24. And this is your perfect grid for any mobile app or any mobile version of the website. For example, when you're creating the responsive web, use these settings. 4 columns. Why 4? Imagine, that you can create, usually we don't need more than 2. Even if we will go with 2 columns here, 2 will be more than enough when you are creating just anything, 20, anything like different cards, you know, all these things. Boom. When you create just something like this, 2 columns is enough, right? But sometimes, really, I prefer to have this flexibility where you will create something that will take, let's imagine, 3 columns here, and here will be some additional information. Or it will be the button here on this side, and there will be an icon on the left side. Perfect. So it gives me more flexibility in terms of, it can be even text here with the name of the person. And on the left side, I will have the avatar of this person. The avatar here and the text goes here. So it allows me to define all the sizes right away with these rulers, with this grid. And when we go to tablet, basically we'll be using absolutely the same settings as from mobile, or you can go with the settings from web. It depends on what you're creating. If you're creating a tablet app, the app for tablet, then I would recommend to go with 24/4. If you are creating something like responsive version of the website, then I would recommend to go with the settings from the web version. And I don't know if I need to create this somewhere here. We defined, oh yeah, let's talk about margins. Margins, yeah, we covered margins. Just nothing to add here. Basically, this is what I wanted to show you, and this is what I wanted to explain, that grids, to create a perfect grid for a project, is really, really easy when you understand the basics, when you understand how it works. Basically, you just need to know the line height of your main body text, and everything else, all the margins, all the gutters, will depend on this line height. This is how simple it is. And then when you will decide to create, for example, the text, even the Instagram carousel post, you can just simply go create the style from this grid. Actually, click here, plus, and then social, actually let's call it web because we use it for web. Let's apply this grid, web, from here. We applied web, but because we have different content here, we can now detach this one and change everything, all the information here. And of course, because you will have different content here and you don't need too much for the content, for mobile version of this carousel, or for this social media post. So we will use 4 columns for our content. For margins, we will be using, it depends on what size of the content you will go, and usually we will go with something like 48 or 42, and which means that we'll just multiply it by, not multiply it actually, we will add plus 16, it will be 58, and this will be more than enough for us to present this content. But in this case, I would probably go with something bigger. How to define actually here, and why I'm still like overthinking these things here. When we are creating the content for social media, it's 1080 by 1080, but basically we are creating just the mobile version, which is 360 by 360. And this, for this mobile version, we'll be using the content which is 16 content, which is 16 points here. And for this one, we will define 24, which means that when we will multiply it by 3, it will be 72. So for this content, which is multiplied by 3, it will be 48, 72 for our main content, which means that for margins we will go with 72 or 72 multiple 2. Then what we will do next, here, gotta 72. Perfect. And then for rows, we can go with these rows in general if we want to, but I wouldn't go with that precise things. We don't need so much flexibility here. What we'll do instead, for the height, we will define like 72, and for the gotta 72. Actually, it can be 0. We don't need to see this. And this is how we created the columns and perfect grid for our social media post, just because we knew the size, the line height of our 24. Because we knew the line height of our social media post, and this allowed us to create our perfect grid. So keep this in mind when you are creating something, that the very first thing you need to define is the line height, and after that you will define the entire grid for your content. This is how simple it is. And then, want to make the content bigger? You can multiply it by 2 or multiply it by 3. Bold. And this will be your heading, and this will be your main text. And because we remember about these things like everything should be perfect, we'll do this. This is how you define the typography also for your social media post. But if we are talking about perfect grid, how to create a perfect grid for your content, simply follow these recommendations and they will answer all your questions, and it will be super easy for you to create any grid for absolutely any project. And I'll see you in the next lesson. We'll be talking about 4 pixels grids.